The rain drowns out the screams, but some horrors refuse to be washed away. When the storm rolls in, so do the things that lurk in the dark, waiting, watching, and never leaving. I've noticed the channel losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways to support me. It's quick, free, and ensures you keep getting awesome content. Your support means everything. Thank you so much. The rain had been relentless all evening, a solid curtain of water that blurred the world outside my car. I was driving back from a late visit with my parents, who lived a few towns over. The route was familiar, winding through rolling hills and patches of forest. On clear nights, it was a beautiful drive, the kind where you could roll down the windows and let the cool air in. But tonight, the storm turned the road into a dark, slick nightmare. I had the radio on for company, but the static kept cutting in, so I turned it off. The only sounds left were the hum of my tires against the wet pavement and the steady thrum of rain hitting the windshield. My wipers struggled to keep up, and even though I knew the road well, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It started small, a flicker of movement in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just the rain playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. A figure, faint and shadowy, sitting in the back seat. My heart jumped into my throat. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly before coming to a stop in the middle of the empty road. I whipped around, shining my phone's flashlight into the back seat. Nothing. It was empty. I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself. I'd been up since 6 that morning, and the long day was clearly catching up with me. Get a grip, I muttered, shaking my head. I put the car back in gear and kept driving. But the unease didn't go away. The rain seemed heavier now, the sound of it almost deafening inside the car. My hands tightened on the wheel as I forced myself to focus on the road. I didn't dare glance at the mirror again, but every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of something in the back seat. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, soaked to the bone, his thumb out in the universal hitchhiking gesture. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap, and he looked completely out of place in the middle of nowhere on a night like this. I should have kept driving. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore him, to not take my eyes off the road. But the thought of leaving someone stranded in this weather made my stomach twist. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. The man jogged up to the passenger side window, his face partially obscured by the brim of his cap. I rolled the window down just a crack, enough to hear him over the rain. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "My car broke down a couple of miles back. Can you give me a lift to town?" I hesitated, glancing at the empty road ahead. "Sure," I said finally, unlocking the door. "Hop in." He climbed in, bringing the smell of wet clothes and cold air with him. He didn't say much as we drove, just sat with his hands in his lap, staring straight ahead. I tried to make small talk, asked him where he was from, what had happened to his car, but his answers were short and vague. Something about him put me on edge, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. About 10 minutes into the drive, he finally spoke. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said, his tone matter of fact. I glanced at him, startled. "Why's that?" He turned his head to look at me, and for the first time, I saw his face clearly. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were dark and sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. There was a strange, almost predatory glint in his expression that sent a chill down my spine. "You don't know who I am," he said. "And you don't know what's out here." I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I figured you needed help. That's all." He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then he said, "They're following us." My grip on the wheel tightened. "Who's following us?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You'll see." Before I could ask what he meant, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights dimmed, and the wipers stopped mid-swipe, leaving me in near total darkness. I coasted to the side of the road, my heart pounding. "What the hell?" I muttered, fumbling for my phone. The battery was low, but I managed to turn on the flashlight. I opened the hood and stepped out into the rain, the beam of my light illuminating the engine. Everything looked fine, no smoke, no strange smells. But the car wouldn't start. When I climbed back inside, the man was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was slightly ajar. I shone my flashlight outside, scanning the area, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no movement, just the rain and the trees. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, something was standing in the road behind the car. It wasn't the man. This figure was taller, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its skin was pale and glistening, almost reflective in the rain, and its eyes were two pinpricks of light, glowing faintly in the darkness. It started walking toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I scrambled to lock the doors, my hand shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. The figure stopped just a few feet from the back of the car, its glowing eyes fixed on mine in the mirror. And then it smiled. Its mouth stretched wide, far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It pressed one long, spindly hand against the back window, the glass fogging up under its touch. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I grabbed my keys, jammed them into the ignition, and turned. The engine roared to life on the first try, and I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires skidding on the wet pavement as I sped away. I didn't stop until I reached the gas station on the edge of town, where the bright lights and the presence of other people finally made me feel safe. I parked under one of the security cameras and sat there for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. When I finally got out to stretch my legs, I glanced at the back of the car. There was a single handprint on the fogged-up window, long and thin, like nothing I'd ever seen before. I've driven that route dozens of times since, but I've never picked up another hitchhiker. And every time it rains, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. When you grow up in a small mountain town like I did, you get used to certain things, the quiet, the isolation, and the way the weather can change in an instant. Rainstorms are common, especially in the fall, when the clouds seem to hang so low they brush the treetops. But no amount of growing up in these mountains could have prepared me for that night. It was late October, and the rain had been falling steadily for hours. I was home alone, sitting by the wood stove in my little cabin on the outskirts of town. My wife was visiting her sister in the city, and I'd been enjoying the solitude, catching up on some reading and listening to the storm batter the windows. Around 9 o'clock, just as I was thinking about heading to bed, the power went out. I wasn't surprised, it happened often during storms like this. I lit a few candles, stoked the fire, and settled back into my chair, figuring the power would come back eventually. But the quiet that followed the blackout wasn't comforting. The absence of the hum from the fridge or the buzz of the overhead light made the storm outside feel louder, closer. About an hour later, I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The rain was so loud it could have been anything, a branch falling, a gust of wind. But then it came again, louder this time. A deliberate, rhythmic knock. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the door, my heart thudding in my chest. My cabin was at the end of a long, narrow dirt road, surrounded by dense forest. I didn't get visitors, especially not at night and especially not during a storm like this. "Hello," I called out, hesitating with my hand on the doorknob. The knocking stopped. I listened for a moment but heard nothing beyond the rain and the wind. I opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight out into the night. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the empty porch and the muddy yard beyond. No one was there. "Hello," I called again, stepping out onto the porch. The rain soaked through my shirt instantly, and the cold made me shiver. I swept the flashlight across the yard and the tree line but saw nothing. No movement, no footprints in the mud. Just the relentless rain. Feeling unnerved, I went back inside and locked the door. I told myself it was probably just the storm playing tricks on me, but the uneasy feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I added another log to the fire and tried to shake it off. Then the knocking came again, louder this time, and from the back door. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The back door led out to the woods, where the trees pressed in close to the cabin. No one had any reason to be out there, and the thought of someone, or something, lingering in the darkness made my skin crawl. I made my way to the kitchen, where the back door was, and stood there for a long moment, listening. The knocking came again, slower this time, as though whoever, or whatever, was out there wanted to be sure I heard it. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you need help, say something." No answer. I braced myself and yanked the door open, the flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. The yard was empty, the forest beyond shrouded in mist and rain. But just as I was about to close the door, the light caught something, a faint glow, deep in the trees. It looked like a lantern, swaying gently as though someone was carrying it. The glow was pale, almost bluish, and it sent a chill down my spine. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my raincoat and stepped out into the storm, the flashlight in one hand and a hunting knife in the other. The lantern's glow moved further into the woods, and I followed, the rain soaking me to the bone. I told myself it was probably a lost hiker, someone who'd gotten caught in the storm and needed help. But the way the lantern moved, so smooth, so deliberate, made me doubt that. The trees closed in around me as I made my way deeper into the forest. The rain muffled everything, and the only sound was the squelch of my boots in the mud. The lantern stayed just ahead, always out of reach, its glow casting eerie shadows on the trees. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the storm. "Stop. I'm trying to help." The lantern paused for a moment, and I thought whoever was holding it might turn back. But then it moved again, faster this time, weaving through the trees like it was leading me somewhere. I picked up my pace, nearly slipping on the wet ground. The glow led me to a clearing where the rain seemed to ease slightly. In the center of the clearing was an old well, its stone walls slick with moss. The lantern hovered above it for a moment before descending, the glow vanishing into the darkness of the well. I approached cautiously, my flashlight trained on the well. The beam revealed the stone walls, slick and ancient, but the bottom was lost in shadow. I leaned over the edge, shining the light down, and called out, "Hello. Is anyone down there?" No response. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the air around me grew colder, the rain now a soft drizzle. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a faint, wet sound, like something crawling against the stone. It was coming from the well, growing louder with each passing second. I stumbled back as a hand emerged from the darkness, pale and thin, its fingers grasping at the edge of the well. Another hand followed, then a face, a gaunt, hollow-eyed face with water dripping from its cracked lips. The figure pulled itself out of the well with unnatural strength, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet on strings. I ran. I didn't look back as I tore through the forest, the flashlight swinging wildly in my hand. The rain picked up again, soaking my clothes and blurring my vision, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that clearing. When I finally burst out of the woods and reached my cabin, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. I didn't sleep that night, sitting by the fire with my hunting knife in hand, listening to the rain and the faint creaks of the cabin settling. The next morning, when the rain finally stopped, I went back to the clearing. The well was gone. The clearing itself was overgrown with weeds, as though it had been untouched for years. I searched the area, but there was no sign of the lantern or the figure I'd seen. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I've never forgotten the way the lantern's glow seemed to pull me in, or the way the figure moved as it climbed out of the well. And every time it rains, I make sure to lock my doors and stay far away from the woods. Because whatever it was, I'm certain it's still out there, waiting for the next person to follow the light. The rain was unrelenting, a constant drumming against the roof of my small cabin near Willow Creek. It had been a quiet, uneventful day until the storm rolled in, turning the peaceful wilderness into a shadowy, chaotic mess. Nights like this, I usually settled in with a book or caught up on the news, but the unease in the air was hard to ignore. The rain had a way of amplifying every creak, every rustle outside, and tonight, it felt like the entire forest was alive. It wasn't unusual for people to call me when they were in trouble out here. I was the closest thing to law enforcement in the area, a retired sheriff who decided to trade the chaos of city life for the tranquility of the woods. But tranquility doesn't always mean safety, and living this far from town, you learn to trust your instincts. At around 9 p.m., just as I was starting to relax, my phone buzzed. It was one of the locals, Jim Carter, who owned a fishing cabin a couple of miles upriver. "There's someone out here," Jim said, his voice low and tense. I saw them standing near the tree line, watching the cabin. I sat up straighter, the unease I'd felt all day now blooming into something sharper. Could it be a hiker? Someone lost in the storm? No, Jim said firmly. They're not moving, just standing there. It's not right. I yelled out to them, but they didn't respond. I'm on my way, I said, already pulling on my boots. Stay inside, lock your doors. Don't open them for anyone. I grabbed my flashlight, my old sidearm, and a heavy coat before heading out. The rain was even worse than I'd realized, the downpour so thick it felt like stepping into a wall of water. I climbed into my truck and started down the narrow dirt road toward Jim's cabin, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. The drive took longer than usual, the muddy roads slowing me to a crawl. The trees on either side of the road loomed like shadowy sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I knew that was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I reached Jim's cabin, his lights were on, casting a faint glow into the surrounding darkness. I parked the truck and climbed out, the rain soaking through my coat almost instantly. I scanned the tree line with my flashlight but saw nothing unusual. Jim opened the door a crack when I knocked, his face pale and anxious. I haven't seen them again, he said, letting me in. But I swear, they were there. All right, I said, shaking off the rain. Where did you see them? He led me to the back of the cabin, where a large picture window overlooked the woods. Right there, he said, pointing to a spot about 50 yards from the cabin. Between those two big oaks. I stepped closer to the window, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The rain made it nearly impossible to see, but I could make out the faint shapes of the trees. Nothing moved. You're sure it wasn't an animal? I asked, turning back to him. Jim shook his head. It was a person. Tall, thin, just standing there. No flashlight, no raincoat. They didn't move for at least 10 minutes. I nodded, though his description didn't sit well with me. Most people wouldn't be out here in this weather without a good reason. Stay here, I said. I'll check it out. He didn't argue, which told me just how scared he was. I stepped back outside, the rain immediately soaking through my clothes again. The beam of my flashlight swept over the trees as I made my way toward the spot Jim had indicated. The ground was slick with mud, and every step was accompanied by the squelch of wet earth. When I reached the trees, I found nothing, no footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been there. But as I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound, like someone tapping on wood. I froze, straining to pinpoint the direction of the noise. It was coming from deeper in the woods, faint but distinct. Against my better judgment, I followed it, my flashlight cutting through the rain and fog. The tapping grew louder as I approached, until I finally found the source, a large tree with deep, claw-like marks carved into its trunk. The marks were fresh, the wood still raw and pale, and the tapping sound had stopped as soon as I arrived. I shone the flashlight around, my heart pounding. The forest was silent except for the rain, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Hello. I called out, my voice barely carrying over the storm. If someone's out here, you need to leave. This is private property. No response. I backed away from the tree, my grip tightening on the flashlight. As I turned to head back to the cabin, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing just beyond the edge of the light. I swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam caught only empty air. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, every shadow seeming to shift and writhe. The walk back to Jim's cabin felt much longer than the walk out. Every sound, every flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, set my nerves on edge. When I finally reached the cabin, I knocked on the door and Jim let me in, his face pale. Did you see them? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No, I admitted. But I found something strange, a tree with marks on it, like someone had been clawing at it. You didn't hear anything earlier? Tapping, maybe. Jim shook his head. No. Just the rain. I stayed with him for another hour, keeping watch and scanning the woods from the window. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the oppressive feeling of being watched never quite went away. Eventually, I convinced Jim to pack a bag and come back to my cabin for the night. As we drove away, the headlights caught something at the edge of the tree line, a tall, thin figure standing motionless in the rain. I didn't stop, and I didn't look back. The next morning, when the storm had passed, I returned to Jim's cabin to take another look. The tree with the claw marks was gone. Not just the marks, the entire tree. In its place was an empty patch of ground, as if it had never been there at all. I don't know who, or what, was in the woods that night, but I've never forgotten the way it felt to see that figure in the rain. To this day, whenever I patrol near Willow Creek, I keep my flashlight close and my eyes on the trees, half expecting to see that motionless figure watching from the shadows. The rain had started just as my shift was ending. I'd been filling in as a park ranger for a buddy of mine who had called in sick, and my job that night had been simple: patrol the trails around Glenview Lake, make sure no campers had overstayed their welcome, and lock up the visitor center. The area was known for its peaceful hiking trails and glassy lake, but on a stormy night like this, it felt more like something out of a Gothic painting: gray, brooding, and strangely still. By the time I finished locking up the visitor center, the rain was coming down in sheets, turning the dirt paths into slippery rivers of mud. I climbed into my truck and was about to head back toward the main road when my radio crackled to life. Unit 7, we've got a report of a woman near the North Dock. Caller said she's crying and looks distressed. Can you check it out? I frowned, leaning over to grab the mic. The North Dock was a small, isolated pier on the far side of the lake. It was a popular spot for fishing during the day, but at night, it was eerie and secluded, surrounded by dense woods. Copy that, I replied. Heading there now. The drive to the North Dock took about 15 minutes. The rain made the dirt roads nearly impassable, and the truck's headlights barely cut through the fog rolling off the lake. As I neared the dock, I slowed, my eyes scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. And then I saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the dock, her back to me, her shoulders hunched as though she were shivering. Her long, dark hair clung to her face and neck, plastered down by the rain. Even from a distance, I could hear the faint sound of her crying, a soft, mournful wail that carried over the water. I parked the truck and stepped out, pulling my hood up against the rain. The sound of her crying grew louder as I approached, and something about it made my skin prickle. It wasn't just sadness in her voice, it was something deeper, something that felt wrong. Ma'am. I called out, stopping a few feet from the dock. Are you all right? She didn't respond. She just kept crying, her thin shoulders shaking with each sob. I stepped closer, the wooden planks of the dock creaking under my weight. Ma'am, I'm with the Park Service, I said, keeping my voice calm. Are you hurt? Do you need help? Still, no response. I was about to reach out and touch her shoulder when she stopped crying. The sudden silence was jarring, and for a moment, the only sound was the rain hitting the lake. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and my breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were swollen and red, as though she'd been crying for hours. But it was her expression that stopped me cold. She wasn't looking at me with gratitude or relief, she was looking at me with a strange, hollow intensity, like she could see straight through me. Are you okay? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed toward the water, her finger trembling as though the effort of raising it was too much. I followed her gesture, my flashlight sweeping across the surface of the lake. At first, I didn't see anything. The water was dark and choppy, the rain creating ripples that distorted the reflection of the trees. But then, near the middle of the lake, something broke the surface, a pale, round shape bobbing in the water. My heart raced as I strained to see what it was. It looked like a head, the features obscured by distance and the rain. The longer I stared, the more certain I became that it wasn't just a log or debris. It was a person. I'll call for help, I said, turning back to the woman. But she was gone. I froze, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the dock. She had been right there, only a few feet away, but now the dock was empty. I stepped back, my boots slipping slightly on the wet wood, and scanned the shoreline. Nothing. A loud splash brought my attention back to the lake. The pale shape was gone, replaced by a series of ripples that spread outward like something large had just gone under. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the rain, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I stumbled back toward the truck, my breathing shallow. As I climbed into the cab, I grabbed the radio with shaking hands. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need assistance at the North Dock. Possible person in the water. Over. The response was garbled, static hissing through the speaker. I repeated the message, but the radio remained silent. The isolation of the dock pressed in around me, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I started the engine and turned the truck toward the main road, my headlights illuminating the rain-soaked trees. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the woman standing in the road behind me. But the road was empty, the only movement coming from the rain and the wind. When I reached the ranger station, I filed a report about what I'd seen. A search team was dispatched to the North Dock the next morning, but they didn't find anything, no woman, no body in the water, no sign that anyone had been there. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of her face or the way she had pointed toward the lake. I avoided the North Dock, even during the day, and started taking different routes during my patrols. But the story didn't end there. A few months later, I heard about a hiker who had gone missing near Glenview Lake. Her friends reported that she'd wandered off during a storm and never came back. Search parties scoured the area, but all they found was a single shoe, half buried in the mud near the water's edge. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain is heavy and the wind howls through the trees, I think about the woman on the dock. I wonder if she was trying to warn me, if the pale shape in the water was her, or if she was something else entirely. And I wonder if, someday, someone else will see her, crying softly by the lake, waiting for the next person to come too close. The rain that night was relentless, the kind of downpour that blurred the lines between the road and the shoulder, leaving you squinting through the windshield. I was driving home after a double shift at the hospital, my scrubs damp and my body aching from a long day of running between patients. The back roads were deserted, just the glow of my headlights reflecting off the wet pavement and the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the endless stretch of forest. Grayson Road wasn't my usual route, but the storm had caused a detour on the main highway. I knew the area well enough, but even so, something about the road felt off that night. The rain distorted everything, and the trees seemed to press closer, their branches clawing at the edges of my vision. About 10 minutes into the detour, I saw it, a house, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It sat back from the road, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. The paint was peeling, the windows dark, and the porch sagging under years of neglect. I'd driven this route a handful of times before, but I'd never noticed the house. Then I saw the light. It was faint at first, flickering like a candle in one of the upstairs windows. My first thought was that it was squatters or maybe someone trying to ride out the storm, but the longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. The light didn't move, didn't sway like a candle or a flashlight. It was steady, cold, and unnatural. I told myself to keep driving. I even reached for the gearshift, ready to move on, but then I saw the figure, a woman standing on the porch, her outline barely visible through the rain. She was holding something in her arms, cradling it like a child. My stomach twisted. I rolled down the window just enough to call out. "Ma'am. Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't even look at me. She just stood there, swaying slightly, her head bowed over whatever she was holding. "Ma'am." I called again, louder this time. "Are you all right?" Still nothing. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to drive away, but the nurse in me couldn't just leave her there. I turned off the engine, grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes immediately, chilling me to the bone. As I approached the house, the sound of the rain seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness. The woman didn't move, didn't react to my flashlight beam as it swept over her. I stopped at the base of the porch steps, my boots sinking into the muddy ground. "Ma'am, I'm here to help," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Is everything all right?" Slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the dim light, and her eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull me in. She smiled faintly, a soft, haunting curve of her lips, and whispered something I couldn't hear over the rain. "What did you say?" I asked, stepping closer. She turned without a word and walked into the house, the door creaking shut behind her. I froze, torn between the urge to run and the nagging responsibility to make sure she was okay. Against my better judgment, I followed her. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and something metallic. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing rotted wood beneath, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room. "Ma'am," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Where are you?" No response. I moved deeper into the house, the beam of my flashlight catching glimpses of broken furniture and shattered glass. The room was eerily cold, colder than the rain outside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I heard it, a soft, muffled cry coming from upstairs. It was faint, like the whimper of a child, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Hello," I called, my heart racing. "Who's up there?" The crying continued, growing louder as I ascended the stairs. Each step groaned under my weight, and the air grew colder with every step. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched out before me, the walls lined with doors. The crying was coming from the last room on the left. I approached slowly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled into the hallway. I pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty except for a crib in the center. It was old and battered, the wood splintered and the mattress yellowed with age. The crying had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made my ears ring. I stepped closer, my flashlight trained on the crib. Something was lying on the mattress, wrapped in a tattered blanket. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled the blanket back. It was a doll, a porcelain doll with cracked skin and empty eyes. Its lips were painted in a small, delicate smile, and its hands were folded neatly across its chest. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The air in the room felt suffocating, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Then, from behind me, I heard the creak of floorboards. I spun around, my flashlight catching the figure of the woman standing in the doorway. She was smiling that same faint, haunting smile, her dark eyes locked onto mine. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in total blackness. I fumbled for the door, my hands trembling, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me, a heavy, oppressive force that made my skin crawl. I don't remember how I got out of the house. The next thing I knew, I was back in my car, the engine running and the rain pounding against the windshield. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel as I sped away. When I reached home, I locked every door and window and sat in the living room with the lights on until dawn. I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But when I checked my flashlight the next morning, I found a single, muddy handprint on the handle, small and delicate, like that of a child. I've never taken Grayson Road since. I don't know who, or what, I saw in that house, but I can still feel her eyes on me whenever it rains. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the faint sound of crying, echoing in the back of my mind. The rain poured relentlessly, drumming against the windshield of my car as I made my way home from a late shift at the diner. The back roads were empty, lined with towering trees whose skeletal branches swayed under the weight of the storm. I had driven this route dozens of times before, but something about the oppressive darkness felt off tonight. My headlights barely cut through the sheets of rain, and every turn felt sharper, every shadow longer. About halfway through the drive, I saw him, a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. He was drenched, his jacket clinging to his frame, and his arm extended in a desperate hitchhiking gesture. My initial instinct was to pass him by. Picking up strangers wasn't something I did, especially not in the middle of nowhere. But as I drove past, I caught a glimpse of his face in my rearview mirror, a gaunt, haunted expression that gnawed at my conscience. I pulled over about 50 yards ahead, my car skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. He ran up to the passenger side, his shoes splashing in puddles, and I rolled down the window just enough to hear him over the storm. "Thank you so much," he panted, his voice trembling. My car broke down a few miles back, and I've been walking for hours. Something in his tone felt genuine, and against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. He climbed in, water pooling beneath him as he settled into the seat. "You're lucky I came along," I said, trying to sound casual. "Not a lot of people take this road at night." He nodded, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "I know. I've been out here too long." As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but his answers were short and vague. He said his name was Mark and that he lived in the next town over. I told him about my shift at the diner, about how the rain always made me uneasy. He didn't reciprocate much, and his silence began to feel heavy. The air in the car grew thick with something unspoken. About 20 minutes into the ride, he finally broke the silence. "I appreciate this," he said, his voice low. "Most people wouldn't stop." "It's no problem," I replied, glancing at him. "We all need a little help sometimes." But when I looked at him, his expression was strange, almost vacant, like he wasn't fully present. His hands were clenched in his lap, and his wet hair dripped steadily onto the seat. "I'm just glad you're not like the others," he muttered. I frowned. "The others?" He didn't answer. Instead, he turned to face me, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. "They never stop. They just keep driving, like I don't exist." I laughed nervously, unsure of what to say. "Well, lucky for you, I'm not like them." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah. Lucky." We continued in silence after that, the rain pounding harder against the car. I kept sneaking glances at him, trying to gauge whether he was just tired or if there was something more to his odd demeanor. My unease grew with every passing mile. Finally, we reached the outskirts of his town. He directed me to a narrow road that wound through a dense forest. The further we went, the more my instincts screamed at me to turn around. The trees pressed in close, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly. "Almost there," he said, his tone eerily calm. I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Where exactly am I dropping you off?" "There's a clearing up ahead," he replied. "You can stop there." When we reached the clearing, I slowed to a stop, my headlights illuminating the open space. It was empty, save for the rain that continued to cascade down in torrents. I turned to him, ready to ask if he needed anything else, but my breath caught in my throat. He was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door was still locked. The only sign he had ever been there was the puddle of water on the floor and the lingering chill in the air. I looked around frantically, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of him outside, no movement in the clearing. I slammed the car into reverse and sped back down the road, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where the rain finally began to let up. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I got home, I checked the passenger seat again. The puddle was gone, as if it had never been there. But the faint scent of rain and something metallic lingered in the air, a reminder of the night I picked up a man who may not have been a man at all. I've worked the night shift as a trucker for over a decade. Long-haul driving isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills, and I've always liked the solitude of the open road. I've seen my share of strange things, deer darting in front of me out of nowhere, headlights that vanish around curves, but nothing compared to what happened on Elmwood Road that rainy night. It started as a routine haul. I was transporting pallets of canned goods from a warehouse in Chicago to a small distribution center in Ohio. The rain had been steady all night, making the highways slick and visibility poor. I'd been driving for about 6 hours straight when my GPS warned me of a traffic backup ahead. It rerouted me onto a secondary road, Elmwood Road, a stretch of pavement I'd never traveled before. The moment I turned onto Elmwood, the atmosphere changed. The road was narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around me. The rain was heavier here, or at least it felt that way, pounding against the windshield like it was trying to get inside. My wipers worked overtime, but the fog rolling off the trees made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. As I navigated the sharp turns, my CB radio crackled to life. Static at first, followed by a faint voice. "Truck on Elmwood, do you copy?" I grabbed the mic, surprised. "This is Rig 57. Who's calling?" The static hissed, then cleared just enough for the voice to come through again. "Be careful. Don't stop." It wasn't uncommon for truckers to warn each other about bad roads or hazards, but something about the voice set me on edge. It was low and distorted, like the speaker was too far from the mic or the signal was being warped by the storm. "Who is this?" I asked, glancing at the radio. "What's the issue?" No response. The static faded, leaving me alone with the sound of the rain and the hum of the engine. I shook my head and focused on the road. Probably just some bored trucker messing with me, I thought. But as I drove, the feeling of unease grew. The trees lining the road seemed to lean closer, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out of the fog. The rain distorted the world outside my cab, turning everything into shifting shadows. About 15 minutes later, I saw it, a pair of hazard lights blinking faintly in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was another truck, pulled over to the side of the road. The trailer was tilted slightly, one of the tires sunk deep into the mud. The cab was dark, no sign of the driver. I slowed to a crawl, my headlights sweeping over the scene. It wasn't unusual for a truck to get stuck on narrow roads like this, especially in bad weather, but the emptiness of the cab gave me pause. "Truck on Elmwood," the voice crackled through the radio again. "Don't stop. Keep moving." I gripped the wheel tightly, my eyes flicking between the stranded truck and the road ahead. Against my better judgment, I pulled over, my rig groaning to a halt behind the other truck. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the rain, the cold instantly soaking through my clothes. "Hello," I called out, approaching the cab. "You need some help?" No answer. The door to the cab was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. I climbed up and shone my flashlight inside. The interior was a mess, papers scattered across the seats, an open thermos spilling coffee onto the floor, and the faint smell of damp leather. But no driver. I stepped back, scanning the area with my flashlight. The woods were thick and dark, the underbrush shifting slightly in the wind. There were no footprints in the mud, no sign that anyone had left the truck recently. A low sound caught my attention, a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on metal. It was coming from the trailer. My pulse quickened as I moved toward the back of the truck, my flashlight cutting through the rain. "Hey!" I called out again. "If you're in there, say something." No response. The tapping stopped, leaving only the sound of rain and my own breathing. I hesitated, then grabbed the handle of the trailer door and yanked it open. The beam of my flashlight revealed rows of pallets, covered in tarps. Nothing out of the ordinary. I was about to close the door when I noticed something, a faint smear of red on the floor, trailing toward the far end of the trailer. My stomach dropped. I climbed inside cautiously, my boots crunching on the wet metal floor. The red smear ended abruptly at the last pallet, but there was no sign of what had caused it. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my heart racing. Then I heard it, the voice from the radio, clearer this time. "Behind you." I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The trailer was empty, but the door I had left open was now shut. I ran to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I banged on the door, shouting for help. The tapping started again, louder this time, echoing through the trailer. It came from all around me, as though the metal walls themselves were alive. The red smear on the floor began to spread, forming strange, jagged patterns that looked almost like writing. The radio in my cab crackled to life, and I could hear the same distorted voice, its tone urgent. "Get out." I slammed my shoulder into the door, desperation giving me strength. On the third try, it flew open, and I stumbled out into the rain. The tapping stopped abruptly, and the woods were silent again. I didn't look back as I climbed into my rig and sped away, my tires kicking up mud as I swerved back onto the road. My hands shook on the wheel, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, where I pulled into a brightly lit truck stop and parked under one of the security cameras. When I checked my trailer the next morning, everything was normal. No red smears, no strange patterns, nothing out of place. The other truck was never reported as stranded, and no missing driver matched the description of the vehicle I'd seen. To this day, I can't explain what happened on Elmwood Road. I've avoided that route ever since, but sometimes, late at night, I think about the voice on the radio. I think about how it knew I had stopped, how it knew where I was. And I wonder if the tapping I heard that night was trying to warn me, or if it was trying to let something out. The storm had been raging all evening, thunder rumbling in the distance as flashes of lightning illuminated the narrow country roads. I was on my way home from a weekend camping trip, my gear packed haphazardly in the trunk of my car. What should have been a relaxing getaway with friends had turned sour after a massive argument, and I'd left earlier than planned, needing to clear my head. The rain was relentless, the kind of downpour that made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My wipers worked furiously, but the darkness and rain made the road feel like a tunnel, the trees on either side looming like sentinels. The GPS had rerouted me onto backroads after detecting an accident on the highway, and now I was on a route I'd never driven before. The bridge came into view about 20 minutes later. It was old, the kind of structure you'd see in postcards, stone arches over a narrow river. In the rain and fog, it looked almost otherworldly, the water beneath it rushing wildly. A sign warned of a weight limit, but my car was well within the threshold. I slowed down, taking in the eerie beauty of the scene as my headlights lit up the wet stone. Halfway across the bridge, I saw her. A woman stood in the middle of the road, her figure barely visible through the rain. She was wearing a long, dark coat, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. She didn't look up as my headlights illuminated her, just stood there with her head bowed, her arms wrapped around herself. I hit the brakes, my car skidding slightly on the wet stone. I came to a stop a few feet away from her, my heart racing. I rolled down the window just enough to call out. "Hey! Are you all right? Do you need help?" She didn't respond. She didn't move. Rain poured into the car as I leaned out, trying to get a better look. "Ma'am. Are you okay?" Still nothing. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes instantly, chilling me to the bone. I approached cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Ma'am," I said again, louder this time. "Are you hurt? Do you need a ride?" She raised her head slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken, as if she hadn't slept, or eaten, in days. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she lifted her arm and pointed to the edge of the bridge. I followed her gesture, my flashlight sweeping over the stone railing. The river below was a churning, chaotic mess, the water swollen from the storm. At first, I didn't see anything, but then the beam caught on something, an old, rusted car partially submerged near the base of the bridge. "What happened?" I asked, turning back to her. But she was gone. I spun around, the flashlight darting over the empty bridge. The woman had vanished, leaving no trace of her presence. The rain continued to pour, the wind howling through the trees, but the silence on the bridge was deafening. I backed toward my car, my pulse racing. I was about to climb back in when a loud, metallic creak made me freeze. It was coming from the submerged car below, the sound echoing up from the river. I turned the flashlight toward it, my breath catching as I saw movement. A figure was climbing out of the wreckage, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were drenched, their clothes clinging to their body, their face obscured by the rain and distance. As they emerged fully from the car, they turned their head upward, staring directly at me. I stumbled back into my car, slamming the door and locking it. My hands fumbled to start the engine, but it stalled on the first try. The figure on the bridge began to move toward me, their gait uneven, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. They moved with a purpose, their dark silhouette growing larger with every step. The engine roared to life on my second attempt, and I didn't waste a second. I slammed the car into reverse, my tires skidding on the wet stone as I backed up off the bridge. The figure continued to approach, their pace steady and unyielding. As soon as I was off the bridge, I threw the car into drive and sped down the road, the headlights barely cutting through the storm. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure chasing me. But the road behind me was empty. I drove for miles, not daring to slow down until I saw the lights of a small gas station. I pulled into the lot, parking under one of the bright overhead lights. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, the rain drumming on the roof of the car. Finally, I got out, making a run for the covered entrance. The clerk behind the counter looked up as I entered, his expression shifting to one of concern. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing my soaked and disheveled appearance. Yeah, I said, my voice shaking. "I think I saw an accident back on the old stone bridge. There was a car in the river and someone on the bridge." The clerk's face paled. "The old stone bridge," he repeated. "You sure?" I nodded, confused by his reaction. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. That bridge has been closed for years. They shut it down after a bad accident back in the 90s. A woman and her kid went off the edge during a storm. Never found the kid's body. I stared at him, my blood running cold. What about the woman? They found her, he said, his tone grim. But she didn't make it. People say her spirit haunts the bridge, still looking for her kid. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the bridge, the submerged car, and the figure climbing out of the wreckage. The clerk's story replayed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd encountered something that wasn't meant to be seen. To this day, I avoid back roads when it rains, and I never, ever stop on bridges. Because some places hold onto their tragedies, and some spirits aren't ready to let go. The rain came down in heavy sheets, turning the dirt road into a muddy mess that clung to my tires and made every mile feel like 10. I was supposed to be at my friend's cabin hours ago, but the storm had slowed me down, and now it was dark, pitch black except for the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the rain. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a chance to unplug and unwind. My friend Jeremy had said the place was cozy, rustic, and just what I needed. I had been looking forward to it, until the storm rolled in. My GPS lost signal about 10 minutes into the woods, but Jeremy had given me clear directions. I took the turns he'd mentioned, passing familiar landmarks like the old bent oak tree and the stone bridge over the creek. But the storm made everything harder to recognize, and after nearly an hour of driving, I realized I was lost. I pulled over to the side of the road, the rain hammering against the roof, and tried to call Jeremy. No signal. Frustrated, I checked the directions again, squinting at the scribbled notes under the dim light of the cabin's interior. I must have missed a turn somewhere, but going back in this weather felt like a gamble. That's when I saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. It was far off the road, barely visible through the downpour, but it was there. At first, I thought it might be Jeremy's cabin, but the light was too dim, too unsteady, like a candle or an old oil lamp. Still, I figured it was worth checking out. Maybe someone there could help me get back on track. I grabbed my raincoat and flashlight, locking the car behind me as I headed toward the light. The rain soaked through my jeans and boots almost immediately, and the muddy ground made every step an effort. The woods were eerily quiet except for the sound of the storm, the trees swaying and creaking in the wind. As I got closer, the light became clearer, a lantern hanging from the porch of a small, weathered cabin. It didn't look like much, the roof sagged, the windows were dark, and the wooden steps leading up to the porch were slick with moss. But the light was inviting, a warm glow in the otherwise cold, wet night. I climbed the steps cautiously, my boots slipping slightly, and knocked on the door. "Hello." I called out, my voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm lost, can you help me?" No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Is anyone home?" The door creaked open a few inches, revealing only darkness inside. The lantern on the porch flickered slightly, as if responding to my presence. I hesitated, glancing back at the woods. The thought of going back to my car and driving aimlessly in the storm wasn't appealing. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, damp wood, mildew, and something metallic, like old blood. My flashlight illuminated a small living space, sparsely furnished with a table, a couple of chairs, and a stone fireplace. Everything was coated in a thin layer of dust, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the room. "Hello." I called again, stepping further inside. My boots left muddy prints on the wooden floor, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. There was no sign of anyone, no personal belongings, no indication that the cabin had been lived in recently. Then I heard it, a faint creak, like a floorboard bending under someone's weight. It came from the back of the cabin, where a narrow hallway disappeared into the darkness. My flashlight trembled slightly as I turned toward the sound. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice shaking. No response. I edged closer to the hallway, my footsteps slow and deliberate. The walls here were lined with old photographs, their frames crooked and covered in grime. The faces in the pictures were faded and indistinct, but their eyes seemed to follow me as I moved past. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar. A faint, rhythmic sound came from behind it, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. My mouth went dry as I reached for the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But something compelled me to keep going. The door creaked open to reveal a small bedroom, empty except for an old iron bed frame and a chair in the corner. The tapping sound stopped the moment I stepped inside. The air was colder here, heavy with a sense of unease that made my skin crawl. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my heart pounding. The bed was bare, its mattress stained and sagging. The chair was empty, its wooden surface worn smooth with age. Nothing moved, nothing seemed out of place, except for the small trapdoor in the floor, its edges outlined in faint, muddy fingerprints. I stared at the trapdoor, a sick feeling settling in my stomach. The prints were fresh, too fresh to have been made before the rain started. Slowly, I crouched down and shone my flashlight on the handle. The metal was scratched and rusted, but the fingerprints were unmistakable. As I reached for the handle, the lantern on the porch suddenly went out, plunging the cabin into total darkness. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight flickering as the sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin, slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath shallow as I tried to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "I have a weapon." A low, raspy laugh answered me, followed by the sound of the trapdoor creaking open behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight on the floor. The trapdoor was ajar, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was icy and foul, like something had been rotting down there for years. Before I could react, a hand shot out from the darkness beneath the trapdoor, pale, clawed, and impossibly strong. It grabbed my ankle, yanking me off balance. I screamed, kicking wildly as I fell to the floor, my flashlight skidding out of reach. The grip on my ankle tightened, dragging me toward the opening. Desperation fueled my movements as I clawed at the floor, my nails splintering against the wood. Just as I was about to be pulled into the darkness, I grabbed the edge of the bed frame and pulled myself free. I didn't look back as I scrambled to my feet and bolted out of the cabin, the rain hitting me like a wall. The woods were a blur as I ran back toward my car, my lungs burning and my heart pounding. I didn't stop until I reached the vehicle, locking the doors behind me and flooring the gas pedal. When I finally reached my friend's cabin, Jeremy was waiting for me on the porch, looking concerned. I told him what had happened, but he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "There's no cabin out there," he said finally. "Nothing but trees for miles." I didn't argue. I didn't go back to check, either. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the sound of that trapdoor creaking open, and I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. The rain started just as I pulled out of the grocery store parking lot, the heavy droplets quickly turning the pavement into a slick, glistening surface. It was one of those nights where everything seemed off, the streets were too quiet, the air too still, and the storm had rolled in so fast it felt unnatural. I had a 30-minute drive ahead of me, back to my small apartment on the outskirts of town. Usually, I enjoyed the solitude of night drives, but tonight, something felt wrong. The road cut through a rural area, flanked by dense woods on either side. The rain made the world outside my car feel closed off, as though the rest of the world had ceased to exist. My wipers fought to keep the windshield clear, but the rain came down in torrents, blurring the edges of the road and forcing me to drive slower than usual. About 15 minutes into the drive, I saw him. He was standing on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. A tall man, wearing a dark raincoat with the hood pulled low over his face. His arm was outstretched, thumb pointed skyward in the universal signal for a ride. Under normal circumstances, I would have driven right past him. But something about the storm, about the sheer desolation of the road, made me hesitate. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. The man approached the passenger side window, moving stiffly as though the cold and wet had seeped into his bones. I rolled down the window just enough to hear him over the rain. "Thanks for stopping," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I just need to get to the next town. My car broke down a few miles back." I hesitated, glancing at the empty road ahead. "All right," I said finally, unlocking the door. "Hop in." He climbed in, bringing a wave of cold air and the smell of damp earth with him. He settled into the seat, his hood still pulled low, casting his face in shadow. Thanks, he muttered again, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. I nodded, pulling back onto the road. Rough night to be out, I said, trying to break the awkward silence. He didn't respond. We drove in silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the rain and the hum of the engine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way he sat, completely still, his hands resting on his knees, made me uneasy. His hood obscured most of his face, but I caught glimpses of pale skin and dark, sunken eyes in the flickering light of passing street lamps. So, I said, forcing a casual tone, what were you doing out here? Driving, he said simply. Where were you headed? Home. I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. The one-word answers weren't helping my nerves, and the oppressive silence in the car made my skin crawl. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't help glancing at him out of the corner of my eye. And that's when I noticed it. His reflection in the passenger side window was wrong. The rain distorted the glass, but I could see it clearly enough. While he sat perfectly still in his seat, his reflection was moving, its head tilting to the side, its mouth curling into a faint, unsettling smile. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my heart racing. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, the rain playing tricks on my eyes. But when I glanced at the window again, the reflection was staring straight at me, its smile widening. I nearly swerved off the road, the tires skidding slightly before I regained control. The man didn't react, didn't acknowledge the near accident at all. He just sat there, silent and still. Everything okay? He asked, his voice calm. Yeah, I lied, my throat dry. Just slippery roads. He didn't respond. I drove for what felt like an eternity, my nerves on edge. The reflection in the window didn't move again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for something. The man's silence became unbearable, the air in the car growing heavier with each passing mile. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled over to the side of the road, the car skidding to a stop in the mud. All right, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. This is as far as I can take you. The man turned his head toward me for the first time, his hood slipping back slightly. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes dark and hollow, like two bottomless pits. He didn't look angry or surprised, just blank. You shouldn't have picked me up, he said softly. What? I asked, my pulse pounding in my ears. You shouldn't have stopped, he repeated, his voice low and even. Now you'll never make it home. The air in the car grew icy, my breath visible in the dim light. Panic surged through me as I reached for the door handle, ready to bolt, but it wouldn't budge. The locks engaged on their own, trapping me inside. The man smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched his lips too wide. They're coming, he whispered. Before I could respond, the windshield fogged over, and the sound of rain was replaced by something else, scratching, like nails dragging across glass. I froze, my eyes darting to the windshield. Through the fog, I could see faint shapes moving outside the car. Tall, spindly figures with glowing eyes, their hands pressed against the glass. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as the figures surrounded the car. My headlights flickered, casting the interior in a strobe-like glow. The man in the passenger seat didn't move, didn't react, as though he couldn't see what was happening. What is this? I shouted, my voice breaking. They've found you, he said, his tone almost sympathetic. You should have kept driving. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was dead, the battery inexplicably drained. The figures outside the car began to press harder against the windows, their faces stretching the glass as though trying to push through. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figures vanished, the fog on the windshield cleared, and the rain returned, soft and steady. I turned to the passenger seat, my heart still racing, but the man was gone. The door was locked, the seatbelt still buckled, but the seat was empty. I sat there for a long time, too afraid to move, the sound of the rain filling the silence. When I finally worked up the courage to start the car, it roared to life without issue. I drove straight home, not daring to look in the rearview mirror the entire way. To this day, I don't know who, or what, I picked up that night. But I've stopped driving at night in the rain, and I never, ever pull over for strangers. Because sometimes, it's not about helping someone in need, it's about keeping yourself safe from whatever waits in the darkness. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.